Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox for Early American Literature. Today, I want to talk about two important and significant figures from the 19th century. Those two figures are Angelina Grimke and Sajoyner Truth, both unapologetic abolitionists, but they're both also, in addition to being abolitionists, they're advocates for women's rights and for women's equality under a white patriarchal system. And part of what's interesting about both Grimke and Truth is they embody with their rhetoric and with their ideals this marriage, no pun intended, between women's rights and abolition. And for many students, if they think about this marriage between those two ideas, women's rights and abolition in the 19th century in this country, they often think of a figure like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote the influential novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. And while Stowe is an important figure, what's often missed or what's often not discussed as much as it should are those figures who were doing similar sorts of work, but didn't perhaps receive, in particular in subsequent generations, the kind of popularity that someone like Stowe received and still enjoys posthumously, of course, even today. Now, that's not to say that people don't read and discuss and write about Sajoyner Truth or Angelina Grimke. They certainly do. My point, quite simply, is we've perhaps collapsed the sheer number of these sorts of figures from the mid-19th century into a figure like Harriet Beecher Stowe. So I don't want you to think that these are individuals who are not discussed. They certainly are, but perhaps not as often and not as frequently as Harriet Beecher Stowe. For example, my experiences as an undergraduate, I never read Angelina Grimke. It wasn't until graduate school that I read Grimke, but I remember in one, perhaps two American literature courses reading and discussing Harriet Beecher Stowe, but rarely, if ever, reading and discussing Grimke. But what I would add to this before we actually go to the text is this additional aspect of their rhetoric and their ideology, and that's Christianity. So once again, we're seeing how writers, thinkers, and influential figures from this early period in the United States, in America, use and deploy Christianity for particular political and ideological purposes. And when thinking about especially someone like Grimke, perhaps you're encouraged to think back to Phyllis Wheatley, perhaps Judith Sargent Murray, or perhaps even farther back, someone like Mary Rowlandson. And if you're interested in exploring the effects of Christianity on some of these American writers and influential figures, you should certainly consider a place for someone like Angelina Grimke and Sajoyner Truth. But let's spend a few minutes talking about Grimke. So Grimke is fascinating because in the early 19th century, she was born into one of the most prestigious, if not arguably the most prestigious, South Carolinian families. She experienced a kind of wealth and privilege and prosperity that very few people have and very few people will experience. There are stories, for example, about every member of the Grimke family having their own personal slaves. So it's not just that she was born into a slave-holding family. She wasn't just born into this plantation slave ideology, but it was taken to what many would describe as an absurd and excessive place. And that, knowing that, certainly foregrounds her abolitionist politics in interesting ways, because she was very much born into a system and was encouraged to think of that system as natural, yet she rebelled against it. And we see in this excerpt from Appeal to the Christian Women of the South this clear blending or marriage between abolitionist politics and women's rights, because this whole excerpt is frankly about the responsibilities and the opportunities that women have as it relates to the possibility for abolition, as it relates to advocacy for abolition, but also as it relates to the power structure that existed and still in many ways, even though it looks fundamentally different in some respects, the power dynamics, the patriarchal power dynamics that dictated and determined society, not just in the American South, but in many, many other places across the world. But one of the places I want to start is with this list on page 784, and this is in direct response to this notion or this idea that women, mothers, grandmothers, daughters, they do not have the power and the capacity to affect change. Grimke even writes, "But I also know that you are the wives and mothers, the sisters and daughters of those who do make laws. And if you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, you are greatly mistaken. You can do much in every way. 4 things I will name, and here are those 4 things. First, you can read on this subject. Then you can pray over this subject. Then you can speak on this subject. Then you can act on this subject. I have not placed reading before praying because I regard it more important, but because in order to pray aright, we must understand what we are praying for. It is only then we can pray with the understanding and the Spirit also." So I think there are a couple of interesting things that Grimke identifies here. The first is, even though she's clear, and I think all of us could understand why she would offer this clarification that she doesn't list reading first because she thinks reading is more important than praying, but she does suggest that before one, and I would just encourage you to pay attention to the sequencing here, because for someone like Grimke, before you can pray, speak, or act correctly, education and the ability to read, and the ability to read in a way that could potentially affect change, that is so incredibly important for Grimke. And here, again, perhaps you're thinking, my God, she sounds so much like Judith Sargent Murray from On the Equality of the Sexes. And it is clear there is a connection here between the importance of reading and education as it relates to everything that follows. But I think what she's also subtly offering here is a program that will allow someone to embrace what for a mid-19th century audience, for regrettably far too many in the mid-19th century, would be a radical political platform. And for someone like Grimke, I would also argue it's important to notice that she thinks and believes, rightly so, that women have a place in this larger political conversation and in this larger political problem that is slavery in the United States, despite the fact that, and she's correct in this regard, that women were not in legislative positions in the late 18th century. Many might argue, and I think she even makes reference to this, that, well, perhaps we are not, this is not our place because we are not responsible for the laws and the documents that legalized slavery. But for someone like Grimke, she certainly thinks that no, there is a place for women in this political project, in this attempt to abolish slavery. And I'll talk about how she connects it to Christianity in just a moment. But I would also encourage you to notice that for someone like Grimke, it is not enough for women to simply read and pray. Notice the final two parts. There's speech and there's action. And again, I think what you're seeing here is an articulation of many of the foundational principles that defined and continue to define the feminist movement. And of course, that is not terminology that Grimke would necessarily have, but it is not unfair or even perhaps inaccurate to describe her as a proto-feminist in a lot of ways. But this emphasis on speech and action, this is something that political movements, whether they are women's rights movements, whether they are civil rights movements, or even if you just think to transcendentalist writers like Henry David Thoreau, movements that are, in theory, designed to liberate individuals as much as possible. Speech, and especially for someone like Thoreau, the precariousness of placing oneself in the public as a vocal figure, someone who speaks on behalf of what they believe and what they think is right. This is so essential, and this is foundational to those different movements. For example, notice on page 785, and here it should be clear, Grimke's writing specifically about prayer, but I think we are almost encouraged to believe that this is something, what I'm about to read, this is something that is applicable both to prayer, but to perhaps all four of these different points she makes. And this is what she writes: "Pray then without ceasing, in the closet and in the social circle." So what I think's important here is how it's not just enough for one to pray in one's private quarters. It's not enough for one to behave ethically and to have certain ethical principles in private. There must be this social or this public dimension to it as well. And again, here, perhaps I am encouraging you to think about someone like Henry David Thoreau, who takes this impetus toward public agitation, this impetus toward a kind of civil disobedience to a potentially extreme point. But notice that Grimke seems to be borrowing this idea in a rather transparent way. Again, it's not enough for you to have and hold these principles in private. You must also have and hold these principles in public as well. Now, the connection she makes to Christianity is equally fascinating as well. And I'll read directly from this excerpt on page 784. And this is what she writes, and I'll read a fair bit here. "The Bible then is the book I want you to read in the spirit of inquiry and the spirit of prayer. Even the enemies of abolitionists acknowledge that their doctrines are drawn from it. In the great mob in Boston last autumn, When the books and papers of the Anti-Slavery Society were thrown out of the windows of their office, one individual laid hold of the Bible and was about tossing it out to the ground when another reminded him that it was the Bible he had in his hand. "Oh, 'tis all one," he replied, and out went the sacred volume along with the rest. We thank him for the acknowledgement. Yes, it is all one, for our books and papers are mostly commentaries on the Bible and the Declaration. Read the Bible, then. It contains the words of Jesus, and they are spirit and life. Judge for yourself whether he sanctioned such a system of oppression and crime. Now, here, pay attention to what Grimke's encouraging her reader to do. Turn to the Bible for answers. And this is something that we've seen writers this semester do with frightening regularity. Maybe you're thinking, for example, about someone like Rawlinson, who seems to have this preternatural ability to connect almost anything to the Bible, at times in ways that were a bit frustrating, and for many of you, at times that seemed to misrepresent what those passages, especially within context, ultimately suggested. But notice what Grimke's saying, that if you use the Bible as an abolitionist tool, which it sounds like from this anecdote in Boston, that's precisely what these pro-slavery individuals were doing. They were bundling or conflating the Bible with all of these abolitionist and anti-slavery texts. If you do that, then perhaps you're offering this endorsement of the Bible and Christianity as a fundamentally abolitionist text, and perhaps by extension, Christianity as a belief system and a religion that is far more interested in cultivating equality than anything else. And by doing that, you're perhaps suggesting that anyone who would cherry pick language from the Bible to support slavery, which people certainly did, they're doing so in bad faith, and they're not representing what's actually there in the text. So I do find it endlessly fascinating how Grimke is ultimately suggesting here that the Bible is this radically abolitionist text, and that would be considered for many in the mid-19th century as radical. And notice who, according to Grimke, has perhaps a unique insight into how to tease those ideas out. Well, they're the mothers and daughters and grandmothers and wives of the United States. They're the ones who seem to have unique access to this particular interpretive lens. And perhaps the final thing I want to mention, and perhaps this is just a particular reading that I have of this excerpt, but it feels, at least to my ear and to my eye, it feels remarkably optimistic in ways that I find quite reassuring. And I'll read here from page 786. And this is her fourth point on action. Act on the subject. Some of you own slaves yourselves. If you believe slavery is sinful, set them at liberty. Undo the heavy burden and let the oppressed go free. So again, she has the ability to quote from the Bible with as much confidence as someone like Rawlinson. If they wish to remain with you, pay them wages. If not, let them leave you. Should they remain, teach them and have them taught the common branches of an English education. They have minds, and those minds ought to be improved. So precious a talent as intellect never was given to be wrapped in a napkin and buried in the earth. It is the duty of all, as far as they can, to improve their own mental faculties, because we are commanded to love God with all of our minds, as well as with all our hearts, and we commit a great sin if we forbid or prevent that cultivation of the mind in others, which would enable them to perform this duty. And I would want to contrast what Grimke writes here to our conversation about Thomas Jefferson. And one of the points I made about his query on natural sciences was there were times when people who were trying to understand race fundamentally misused and misunderstood science as a way of reinforcing racial division and as a way of reinforcing certain awful racial stereotypes. And I mentioned this philosopher named Hegel, this German philosopher, and I told you about this professor of mine, this former professor of mine who wrote a book about Hegel, and what he ultimately argues in that book is that Hegel is a universalist thinker. He's someone who argued for and wrote for universal freedom. He was someone who, if you read his philosophy carefully, clearly believes in what today we would call notions of equality. But there were times when, and he was in many ways a contemporary to or with a figure like Thomas Jefferson, but there were times when he wrote, and it didn't happen often, but it only needs to happen once for it to be a clear problem. However, if you read those passages on race, they read and feel a lot like some of the natural science that this particular moment in time produced and generated. It feels and reads a lot like those sections from Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. And I mentioned that for this former professor of mine, this is a moment when Hegel's earnest attempts to educate himself about race actually pushed him farther away from his philosophy. And by doing so, it seems to reinforce this idea and this notion that sometimes we just inherently and instinctually know what's right. And even though especially someone in my position would always encourage you to read more and learn more, I'm also aware that sometimes if you're not careful, and I include myself in this as well, if all of us are not careful, those earnest attempts to educate ourselves might lead us astray. And what I like about what Grimke suggests here is just how similar she sounds to figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, that perhaps there are times when you know something to be true. You don't need to do anything else to have that truth affirmed. She's in many ways arguing for and advocating for just knowing this truth and not allowing yourself to be led astray by certain ideas and ideologies. So again, perhaps you could argue there's this clear and unambiguous connection between some of the transcendentalist writers that I asked you to read last week and a abolitionist like Angelina Grimke. So let's now transition to Sajoyner Truth, another fascinating figure. Her biography is fundamentally different from Grimke's. She was a former slave who was emancipated in the early 19th century. She became an extremely popular, provocative, and influential figure in abolitionist circles, but she never learned to read or write, which is why we don't have any texts, so to speak, in the way we might have texts from Jefferson, Murray, Grimke, etc. So here, It's worth asking, or at least inviting, this question about mediation that I've spoken about several times this semester, because we don't have her actual words on the page in the same way that we have Grimke's words on the page. But I wonder if, in this respect, that really matters, because we'll talk about Frederick Douglass next week, former slave who became, like Truth, this symbol of abolition and this symbol of equality for African Americans in the 19th century. Again, I would just invite you to consider, to what degree does it really matter in this particular respect, whether what we're reading about Truth is actually the truth. Does that matter at all? Maybe that's a question you could write about in an essay or a response. But you'll also notice that in this speech, or at least in the transcription of this speech, that she also makes reference to women's rights and the importance of equality as it relates to women. She writes, "I have as much muscle as any man, and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed." Notice the inclusion of all of those conjunctions. It's as if this could just continue ad infinitum, which I think is part of her point. And can any man do more than that? I have heard much about the sexes being equal. I can carry as much as any man, and can cut as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man that is now. As for intellect, all I can say is, if woman have a pint and man a quart, why can't she have her little pint full? You need not be afraid to give us our rights, for fear we will take too much, for we can't take more than our pint will hold. The poor men seem to be all in confusion and don't know what to do. Why, children, if you have woman's rights, given it to her, and you will feel better. You will have your own rights, and they won't be so much trouble. I can't read, but I can hear. I have heard the Bible, and have learned that Eve caused man to sin. Well, if woman upset the world, do give her a chance to set it right side up again. So here, yet another writer from this semester who makes reference to the Garden of Eden and this idea, or this narrative, that mankind fell into sin because of women. But you'll notice, unlike Murray, who offers something of a different interpretation for Truth, she seems to, at least in this response, she seems to, and I don't know how much she believes this or believed this. I sincerely doubt she did, but she's using it for rhetorical purposes. She almost concedes the idea that, okay, sure, women, we set mankind on this particular path. Why not give us a chance to make it right again? So I think, and I hope, what you're noticing, especially with this clever rhetorical turn, is just how funny she is. Because I think Sajoyner Truth is endlessly amusing in ways that we often associate with late night hosts today. This almost feels like the kind of monologue that you might see or might imagine late night hosts delivering at 11 or 11:30 p.m. on Comedy Central, for example. But I would also encourage you to pay attention to how she ends this speech, because while there is something playful, there's also something potentially ominous about this. But I also, and maybe ominous is the wrong word, but I do think there is an implied threat here to white male patriarchal control. But she's also offering, but man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on him. Woman is coming on him, and he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. So that final image, there's a hawk on one side, a buzzard on the other, and right in the middle is the symbol of white patriarchal control and power. So again, I'll leave it to you to decide if she's just being perhaps morbidly funny and morbidly comedic, or if there is a possibility that she sees or at least understands and acknowledges some sympathy here, that there will be some loss. But again, I don't know how far I would want to take that, because my God, how much sympathy could anyone really have for white slave owners, and if not slave owners, then individuals who advocated on behalf of slavery. But what I do like about this, but what I also think, regrettably, reading it and thinking about it in 2020 is a bit tragic and perhaps a bit frustrating, is how we're still having this conversation in many ways. Many people would argue that, at least, that what Truth saw on the immediate horizon, perhaps for many people today, still feels like it's on the immediate horizon. So I think that's where I will stop for today. Again, I think with figures like Grimke and Truth, what's interesting about them, just to summarize here at the end, is how they blend or marry abolitionist politics with women's rights, but there's also this added element of Protestant Christianity to it as well. So the point, I suppose, is just pay attention to how, for abolitionists, for what today we would call feminists, what someone like Grimke would call a woman's rights advocate, they're not separate. In many ways, they share a lot of concerns. And even though the forms of oppression they experience look different, and I think even for someone like Grimke, she would never want to indulge a compare and contrast, like who has it better, who has it worse. That's not even on the table. Don't even think about that. But the point seems to be there's a lot of commonality here. There's a lot that we share. And instead of fighting those forms of power and oppression individually or in these smaller isolated groups, what if we just created a coalition around all of these minority concerns? What could we accomplish at that point? And I think both Truth and Grimke represent, at least for someone like Truth in speech, for someone like Grimke on the page, what that blending or what that marriage, what that unity can ultimately look like. Okay, have a good night.